On stage, there's 5,000 people out there coughing and sneezing and laughing and cheering.
Before the knighthood. Before the sold-out arenas and the Christmas number ones and the Queen's sword touching his shoulder. Before any of that, there was a secret. One so carefully protected, so methodically maintained, that even the people closest to him never saw the full picture. 29 years. That is how long Cliff Richard kept the world looking at one version of himself while an entirely different story played out just behind the curtain. And when the truth finally came to light, it didn't arrive the way secrets usually do. No scandal. No confession dragged out by a tabloid. No dramatic unraveling at 3 in the morning with cameras waiting outside. It arrived quietly. And that, somehow, made it more devastating than anything anyone had expected. But to understand the secret, you have to understand the man who built the wall around it. And that story begins not in Britain, not on a stage, not in front of a screaming crowd, but on a ship in the middle of the ocean, somewhere between the life he had and the life that was coming. Harry Roger Webb was 8 years old when his family packed everything they owned and left India behind. His father worked the railways. His mother held the household steady with the particular calm of a woman who understood impermanence better than most. They had lived comfortably in Lucknow, sunshine, warmth, space. Then the politics changed. Then the violence came. Then the world that had felt solid simply stopped being solid. They arrived in Essex in 1948. A council house in Cheshunt. Grey skies. Cold that felt personal. From warmth to drizzle, from one identity to the beginning of another. Harry Webb learned something on that crossing that would shape every decision he made for the next 8 decades. He learned that who you are and who the world sees can be two entirely different things. And that the space between those two versions of a person is not always dishonesty. Sometimes it is simply how you survive. The music arrived at 16. His father bought him a guitar, and within months everything else became secondary. By 1958, Harry had found his way onto a stage, and off it, he found a new name. Cliff, suggested by a promoter. Richard, borrowed from Little Richard by a friend. And just like that, a boy from a council house in Hertfordshire became something the country had been waiting for without knowing it. What followed was not a slow climb. It was an eruption. Move It hit in 1958 and the British music industry shook. Here was their own Elvis, and not a pale imitation, not a polite echo from across the Atlantic, but something raw and electric and entirely English. He formed the Shadows. He made films. Summer Holiday. The Young Ones. A red double-decker bus and a generation of teenagers who watched him and saw everything they wanted their lives to become. He was the most famous young man in Britain. And he had barely turned 20. But fame, for Cliff Richard, was never going to be simple. Because in 1964, at the precise moment when his peers were chasing excess, when the counterculture was burning everything that looked like convention, Cliff stood up at a Billy Graham rally and told the world he had given his life to his Christian faith. Not quietly. Not privately. Publicly. Completely. On a stage in front of thousands. The 1960s were not a gentle decade for sincerity. The Beatles were exploring Eastern mysticism. The Stones were building an empire from scandal. And here was Britain's biggest pop star standing next to a preacher saying, "This is what I believe." Some people laughed. Many people respected it. Most people, eventually, simply accepted it as part of who he was. The clean-cut gentleman of British pop, the Peter Pan who never aged, never married, never gave the tabloids the story they were always quietly hunting for. Decades passed. Christmas number ones. A knighthood in 1995, the first rock star in history to receive one. Sold-out tours. A fan base that had simply grown old alongside him and never once let go. The life, on the surface, was perfect. But perfection is always the surface. Underneath it, a different story had been running in silence for a very long time. For 29 years, people had been asking the same question about Cliff Richard with a particular obsession the British reserve for a mystery they cannot resolve. Why had he never married? What was he protecting? What was the real story? The answer he always gave was consistent, and in its own way completely honest. He was too devoted to the career. The stage consumed him entirely. He had loved, genuinely, seriously, but had always found, at the critical moment, that he could not make the choice that would cost him the thing he loved most. Jackie Irving, a dancer. Summer in Blackpool. He considered proposing. Then he went to his manager and asked one question: would marriage cost him fans? When told he might lose a third of his audience, he ended the relationship immediately. No agonizing. No second chances. Just the calculation, the arithmetic, and then it was over. Piers Morgan, hearing this story on television, called him ruthless. Cliff didn't particularly disagree. There was Delia Wicks, a dancer he had fallen for at the London Palladium in 1960. He liked her deeply. She was his girl. Then the career accelerated beyond anything he had anticipated, and he wrote her a letter. A goodbye dressed up as an explanation. She was devastated. He moved forward.
And then there was Sue Barker. Tennis champion. Television icon. A romance that began when Cliff tracked down her number after watching her win a match, invited her to a concert, and began something the British press followed with delighted attention. Telegrams sent to Japan. Hours of phone calls. Wimbledon summers in each other's company. But the press became too much for her. The age gap concerned her father. A friend called her on Cliff's behalf to say it was over. She found that cold. Things ended. The part Sue Barker never forgave came later. Years after she had moved on, married someone else, built an entirely new life, Cliff kept mentioning her in interviews. Kept telling journalists he had seriously considered proposing but decided he simply hadn't loved her quite enough. She found it publicly humiliating. She wrote in her autobiography that if she had known she would still be hearing about a few months of dating 40 years later, she would never have gone near him. She asked him repeatedly to stop. He largely did not. This was the double life that no one quite talked about. Not a dramatic secret. Something subtler, and in some ways more revealing. A man who had made a series of calculated choices about love, always chosen fame over the person in front of him, and who seemed, in the retelling, to not fully grasp what those choices had cost the women involved. But that was not the secret that would nearly destroy him. In the summer of 2014, without warning, everything became something else entirely. An allegation emerged. A claim that Cliff Richard had sexually abused a 15-year-old boy at a Billy Graham rally in Sheffield in 1985. Then 4 more men came forward. The Crown Prosecution Service received the cases. And the BBC, in a decision that would eventually cost them enormously, broadcast live footage of police searching his home while he was still abroad, before he had been spoken to, charged, or arrested. The world watched a national treasure being taken apart in real time. Live. On television. While he sat in a house in Portugal having absolutely no idea it was happening. Cliff Richard maintained his innocence from the first moment to the last. The cases were eventually dropped. No charges were ever filed. There was insufficient evidence. But the damage, to his sense of self, to the identity he had spent 60 years constructing with extraordinary precision, that damage was real and it did not heal quickly. He described lying awake at night with the weight of it sitting on his chest like something physical. He described a hatred so violent it frightened him, not for his accuser specifically, but for the very concept of what had been done to an innocent person. He reached a point, he said, where he simply did not know if he could keep going. His body registered what his composure would not show. Shingles spread across his forehead, moving toward his eyes. A doctor told him he was at risk of losing his sight. And when Cliff asked how a person develops shingles, the doctor told him plainly, it comes from the kind of stress that has been eating at you from the inside for a long time. He sued the BBC. He won. And then he became one of Britain's most vocal advocates for changing the law so that people accused of crimes cannot be publicly named before they are formally charged. Not from bitterness, he insisted. From the absolute conviction that no one else should have to survive what he had survived. He made one more decision. Deliberate and final. He would never learn his accuser's name. He did not want a face. He did not want the hatred to have a place to live. He chose to close the door on that darkness and walk back into the light. But the secrets were not finished with him yet. In 2024, preparing for a major tour of Australia and New Zealand, Cliff Richard sat down in front of a camera and told the world something no one had seen coming. A routine insurance medical check, required by a promoter, had found a tumor. Early-stage prostate cancer. Discovered only because someone had required him to be examined before they would insure his tour dates. He had been rehearsing. He had been smiling for photographs. He had been preparing to stand in front of tens of thousands of people while carrying this specific weight in silence. And then he was cleared. And then he decided to speak, not for sympathy, but to make a single urgent point that he felt he had earned the right to make. Men do not get checked. Men feel invincible. Men die from exactly that particular arrogance. He sat with Dermot Murnaghan, a man navigating his own stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and spoke with the stripped honesty of someone who has been through enough to have stopped caring entirely about appearances. He is ready to stand beside King Charles, who has fought his own battle, and shout this message from every platform they can find together. 29 years of protecting a private world from cameras that never stopped looking. A series of loves chosen against and then revisited in ways the women involved never asked for. An accusation that nearly erased him. A diagnosis carried in silence until he was certain he was still standing. And underneath all of it, the thing the tabloids never quite managed to find in all their decades of searching. A man who gave away 10% of everything he ever earned to people he would never meet. Who flew to Uganda and Brazil to see the poverty his donations were fighting with his own eyes. Who raised millions for Alzheimer's research because he watched his own mother disappear into that particular darkness. Who sat beside his tiny nephew's hospital bed for 4 months and then spent years fundraising for the ward that saved that boy's life. Who built a tennis foundation that put rackets into the hands of 200,000 children who otherwise would never have held one. The mystery of Cliff Richard, it turns out, was never what anyone thought it was. The man behind the curtain was not hiding scandal. He was hiding something far less dramatic and far more human. The fear. The grief. The choices he could not take back. The prayers he was not always sure anyone was answering. The cancer he did not know how to say out loud until he was safely on the other side of it. He was hiding the fact that even a legend, even a man with a knighthood and a 70-year career and a voice that has never once left him, is still just a person trying to survive the life they have been given. At 85 years old, with all of it sitting behind him now like a landscape crossed on foot, Sir Cliff Richard is finally letting the curtain come down. And what is standing behind it is more extraordinary than the performance ever was.